The entire kitchen went silent. The moment the smoke alarm stopped screaming and the head chef walked out of the back room with that look on his face. The one every cook in a professional kitchen learns to fear. He didn't say much, he didn't have to. "This food is an embarrassment," Raymond Holt said, loud enough for the whole dining room prep staff to hear. And that man standing over the stove right now should never have been allowed near a burner in this building. The man he was talking about was standing 6 feet away, still holding a saucepan. His name was Thomas Briggs. He was 43 years old, wore a second-hand chef's coat with a small grease stain near the collar that never quite washed out, and had been working the lunch shift at Holt's Fine Dining in downtown Charleston for exactly 11 days. He didn't say anything back. He set the pan down carefully, wiped his hands on a side towel, and looked at the floor. The other cooks didn't look at him. That was almost worse. Raymond Holt had built his restaurant empire over 2 decades of calculated cruelty dressed up as high standards. 3 locations, a James Beard nomination that he mentioned in every interview he gave, a reputation for producing talented sous chefs who left his kitchens emotionally destroyed, but technically brilliant. He was the kind of man who believed that pressure either forged diamonds or exposed weakness, and he had very little patience for weakness. What he didn't know, what nobody in that kitchen knew yet, was exactly who Thomas Briggs actually was. Thomas had grown up in food. Not restaurant food, real food. His grandmother's kitchen in rural Georgia, where she made biscuits from memory, and kept a cast-iron skillet, so well seasoned, it was practically a family heirloom. His mother canned vegetables every August. His father could smoke a pork shoulder for 14 hours, without a thermometer, and hit the exact right temperature by feel alone. Food wasn't a career path in the Briggs family. It was a language. He discovered formal cooking late, the way some people discover the thing they were meant to do, only after spending years doing everything else. He was 26 when he enrolled in culinary school in Atlanta, older than most of his classmates, paying tuition with money from a construction job he worked nights. He was 30 when he staged at a small but serious French restaurant in Savannah. 32 when he opened his own place, 18 tables, exposed brick, a menu that changed weekly, based on what looked good at the farmer's market that Saturday morning. The restaurant was called Ruth's, named after his grandmother. For 4 years it worked. Not perfectly, small restaurants never work perfectly, but it worked in the way that matters. People reserved tables weeks out. The local paper wrote a piece about it. A food critic from Atlanta drove down twice in 1 year, tossed 6 days a week and loved nearly every hour of it. Then his wife, Claire, got sick. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in October. By the following spring, she was gone. 38 years old, their daughter, Nora, was 7. Thomas closed Ruth's 3 months after Claire's funeral. He told himself it was temporary, that he just needed time. But grief does strange things to a person's sense of time, and temporary stretched into 6 months. Then a year. The savings ran out faster than he expected. Medical bills have a way of doing that. He sold the restaurant equipment, then the building lease, then the car Claire had loved, a faded blue station wagon she'd named Gerald for reasons she thought were hilarious, and that Thomas had pretended to find annoying. By the time Nora was 9, Thomas was taking whatever kitchen work he could find. Diner breakfast shifts, catering prep, one miserable winter cooking institutional food at a hospital cafeteria, where the overhead lights buzzed constantly, and the most creative thing he made all day was chicken noodle soup from a powder base. He did it all without complaint, because Nora needed new shoes, and the heating bill was due, and complaints didn't accomplish anything useful. He applied to Holt's Fine Dining, because a former colleague mentioned they had an opening, and the pay was significantly better than what he was making. He didn't mention Ruth's in the interview, he didn't mention Claire. He showed up, answered the questions he was asked, and got the job. He did not expect Raymond Holt to become the defining obstacle of what happened next. The incident with the saucepan was about a sauce, a beurre blanc that Thomas had pulled slightly too early, because the kitchen was understaffed that afternoon, and he was managing 3 other elements simultaneously. It was not his finest moment. It was also, objectively, a recoverable mistake that any experienced cook would have recognized as minor. Raymond Holt did not treat it as minor. He came into the kitchen 20 minutes before dinner service, tasted the sauce, and made a decision about Thomas Briggs, in approximately 4 seconds. That decision was, "This man does not belong here." The judgment wasn't entirely about the sauce. Thomas understood that later. It was about appearance, it was about the second-hand coat, and the quiet manner, and the way Thomas didn't flinch, or apologize theatrically when Raymond criticized him, just nodded and absorbed it. Raymond Holt had a specific idea of what talent looked like, and Thomas didn't match it. "You've got 2 weeks left on your trial period," Raymond told him, at the end of service that night, not looking up from the reservation book. "I'd start thinking about whether this environment is the right fit for you." It was a very polished way of telling someone they were going to be fired. Thomas drove home that night in silence. Nora was asleep when he got in, her homework finished and left in a neat stack on the kitchen table the way he'd asked her to. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, just stood there, not doing anything, just looking at his daughter asleep in the dark. And then he went to the kitchen and started doing what he always did when things felt too heavy to carry, standing still. He cooked. Nothing specific. No recipe. He worked through what was in the refrigerator. Half an onion, some thyme going slightly dry, a chicken carcass he'd been saving for stock. He made a simple broth, and stood over the stove while it simmered, and slowly the weight in his chest loosened just enough to breathe through. He wasn't broken, he knew that. He also knew that knowing it and feeling it were two different things, and that the distance between them could feel very large at 2 in the morning in a quiet house. What Thomas didn't know was that he had been seen. Not by Raymond. By someone else. Her name was Margaret Ossie. She was 51 years old, had built a food and hospitality company from a single catering van she'd driven herself in her late 20s, and now oversaw a portfolio that included 4 restaurants, a culinary education nonprofit, and a hospitality consulting firm with clients across the Southeast. She had known Raymond Holt professionally for years, and respected his technical ability, while finding his management style destructive and his ego exhausting. She had come to Holt's that afternoon to discuss a potential collaboration, a fundraising dinner for her nonprofit that she'd hoped to host at one of his locations. She arrived early, was asked to wait at the bar, and from that vantage point she had watched the entire incident with the saucepan. She watched Raymond's performance, she watched Thomas's response, and she watched something most people in the kitchen were too busy or too intimidated to notice. The moment before Thomas set the pan down, he had adjusted the heat on 2 adjacent burners, without being asked, with the quiet automatic competence of someone whose hands know what to do before their brain catches up. That was the gesture of a real cook. Margaret mentioned it casually to one of the servers she'd worked with before at an event. The servers told her, also casually, that Thomas had apparently run his own restaurant for years before something happened and he'd had to close it. She didn't get the full story, but she remembered the name, Thomas Briggs. 3 days later she came back to Holt's for dinner. She sat in the main dining room and ordered the tasting menu and paid careful attention to which dishes came out of the kitchen with something extra in them. Some quality of attention, or care or instinct, that went beyond execution of a recipe. 2 of the courses had it. She asked the server which station had prepared them. Thomas Briggs. She left that evening, knowing she was going to offer that man a job. She just needed to figure out what job, exactly, and how to approach it, without stepping on whatever was happening in that kitchen politically. She didn't have to wait long for the situation to resolve itself. Raymond fired Thomas on a Wednesday. Not at the end of the trial period, but early, 4 days before it ended. Because a food journalist had reached out requesting information about the restaurant's kitchen team for an upcoming feature. And Raymond had decided, with the particular logic of insecure powerful people, that he wanted to present a cleaner picture. He called Thomas into the small office off the kitchen and said, with great professionalism, that the fit wasn't right, and the restaurant was moving in a different direction. Thomas thanked him for the opportunity. He meant it. He collected his knife roll from his locker and said goodbye to the 2 line cooks, who were his closest thing to colleagues there. A young woman named Becca, who was genuinely talented and deserved better than Raymond's kitchen. And a quiet older man who worked the grill station and had once, without being asked, covered Thomas's break so he could take a call from Nora's school. Thomas shook their hands. He walked out into the afternoon sun. He sat in his car for a while, not crying, not angry, just sitting. Eventually he started the engine and drove to pick up Nora from school. She was waiting on the front steps with her backpack on, watching the street for his car. When she spotted it, she stood up immediately and waved with her whole arm. An enormous wave, completely unself-conscious. The way children wave when they're genuinely glad to see someone. He pulled to the curb, and she climbed in and started talking, before the door was fully closed. Telling him about something that happened at lunch, a disagreement with a friend that had apparently resolved itself by the end of the day, and was now a funny story. He listened. He laughed at the right places. He stopped at the grocery store because they needed milk and eggs, and also because Nora had been asking for the ingredients to make snickerdoodles for the past week. And he had kept putting it off. They made the cookies that evening after dinner, Nora standing on the step stool she'd had since she was 4, and that she still used, even though she was now tall enough not to need it. Stirring the dough with total seriousness, while Thomas rolled the portions in cinnamon sugar. The kitchen smelled like warmth. It smelled like the only thing that had never let him down. He didn't tell her he'd lost the job that day. He would, just not that night. Margaret Osei called him 4 days later. He almost didn't answer. Unknown number, middle of the day, and he was in the middle of updating his resume with a level of optimism he wasn't entirely feeling. She introduced herself simply, her name, her company, and the fact that she had eaten at Holt's twice recently and had been paying attention to his work. She did not explain the full context. She just said she believed he was underutilized, and that she had a proposal she'd like to discuss over coffee if he was open to it. He said yes. He was not sure why he believed her. He had been on the receiving end of enough professional disappointment, that he'd developed a reasonable skepticism about unexpected phone calls, bearing good news. But something in her voice was direct in a way that felt trustworthy. No performance, no build-up, just a person who knew what she wanted to say, and said it. They met the following morning at a coffee shop near her office. She arrived first, and was reading something on her phone, when he walked in, and she stood up immediately and shook his hand with the focused attention of someone who took people seriously on sight. She told him about the non-profit Lakeview Culinary, which she'd founded 8 years earlier, to provide culinary training and food service career pathways for adults transitioning out of incarceration, out of homelessness, or out of other circumstances that had closed conventional doors. The program had graduated 340 people in 7 years. 68% of graduates were employed in food service within 6 months. Several former students had gone on to open their own operations. Then she told him what she needed. The nonprofit's anchor program, a 6-week intensive culinary training course, had been running successfully but was about to expand to a second location, in Columbia, South Carolina. She needed someone to design the curriculum for the expanded program and serve as its lead instructor. Someone who understood food at a deep technical level, but also understood, from personal experience, what it meant to lose something and rebuild. She was quiet for a moment after she said that last part. "I've done some research," she told him. "I know about Ruth's, I know what happened. I'm not asking you to share anything you don't want to share. But I want you to know that I think the people in this program would learn more from you than from someone who's never had to start over." Thomas looked down at his coffee cup. He had not heard anyone say his restaurant's name out loud in almost 2 years. He told her he needed a few days to think about it. He thought about it for exactly 1 day. That evening, after Nora was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list. Something he'd gotten in the habit of doing when decisions felt too large to hold in his head all at once. He wrote what he would be giving up, which was not much. The possibility of another restaurant kitchen job that would likely pay better in the short term. He wrote what he would be gaining, which was harder to quantify. Work that mattered in a direction that felt true to something he hadn't quite named yet. He thought about his grandmother's kitchen. About why food had ever meant anything to him in the first place. Not because it was impressive, or because it produced recognition. But because it was the most direct form of care he knew. You made something with your hands and gave it to someone and they were, in some small way, better for it. That was the whole mechanism. Everything else, the reviews, the reputation, the James Beard nominations that people like Raymond Holt collected like trophies, was secondary to that mechanism. He called Margaret the next morning and said yes. The first class in Columbia started on a Monday in March with 14 students. Thomas stood in front of them in a borrowed kitchen space in a community center on the east side of the city and looked at the group. A 22-year-old, who'd been out of a youth detention facility for 6 months and wanted to become a pastry chef. A 58-year-old woman who'd spent 30 years in a job she described as nothing, and had decided, after her youngest child left home, that she wanted to do something with her hands. A man about Thomas's age who had rebuilt his life after addiction and was looking for work that gave him structure and purpose. 7 others who each carried their own weight of circumstance and their own specific reasons for being in that room. Thomas didn't begin with technique. He began with a question. He asked each of them to tell him about a meal they remembered, not their favorite meal necessarily, but a meal that stayed with them, one they could still taste. They went around the room. The answers were extraordinary in their specificity. The 22-year-old described his great-aunt's red beans and rice with a precision of detail, the specific day of the week she made it, the sound of the pot, the way she always put too much hot sauce in and then acted surprised. That made the whole room laugh. The 58-year-old woman talked about Thanksgiving at her mother's house when she was a child and started crying partway through and didn't apologize for it, and no one expected her to. The man who'd rebuilt his life after addiction was quiet for a moment, and then he described a bowl of soup he'd eaten at a shelter 6 years ago. Nothing fancy, just vegetable soup. And said it was the first time in a long time he'd felt like someone had made something specifically so that he could eat it. Thomas listened to all of it, then he said, "That's what we're learning to do. Not just cook for someone. There's a difference." The 14 people in that room looked at him differently after that. Not with awe, with recognition, as if he'd said something they already knew but hadn't heard put into words. Nora came with him on weekends, when the Columbia program ran Saturday sessions. She sat in the corner of the kitchen with her homework or a book, occasionally recruited to taste things, occasionally recruited to help with washing dishes, a task she performed with great drama and zero efficiency, and occasional moments of genuine helpfulness. The students loved her. She had Claire's way of making people feel immediately comfortable, a warmth so natural it didn't read as performance, it just read as her. Thomas saw Claire in her constantly. It was the good kind of grief, the kind that hurts not because something is gone, but because something still exists. Margaret visited the Columbia program 6 weeks in, on the Friday of the first cohort's graduation ceremony. It was a small event, family and friends in folding chairs, a meal prepared by the students themselves, certificates printed on cardstock. Thomas had stayed up until midnight. The night before, helping one student who was struggling with timing his dishes, so everything would be ready at once. They'd run the menu twice in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, while Nora slept on a folded catering tablecloth in the corner office. Margaret sat in the front row and watched the ceremony. Afterward she found Thomas in the kitchen, helping clean up. "You know I've been to every graduation we've held," she said, 42 of them, this one was different. He asked what was different about it. She thought for a moment. Usually the students are proud of what they learned. Today they were proud of who they'd become while learning it. That's a harder thing to teach. Thomas didn't have an answer for that. He just nodded and kept wiping down the counter. The story might have ended there, quietly, usefully, without fanfare. A good man doing good work, a small program making a real difference, which is frankly how most important things happen. Quietly, without an audience, but 6 months after the Columbia program launched, Margaret received an invitation. The Southern Hospitality Summit, the largest food and hospitality conference in the Southeast, held annually in Atlanta, was building its keynote segment around the theme of culinary education and workforce development. They wanted a demonstration kitchen component, real food, prepared live, by real program graduates, in front of an audience of restaurant owners, investors and industry press. Margaret said yes immediately, then she called Thomas. He was not enthusiastic. He had spent the past year doing work he believed in rooms where nobody was watching, and he had been content with that. The idea of standing in front of an industry audience, an audience that included people exactly like Raymond Holt, with students who had been cooking seriously for 6 weeks made him feel something close to protective alarm. What if it goes wrong, he asked. Then it goes wrong in front of people who needed to see what real cooking education looks like, Margaret said. There's no bad version of this. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about the Tuesday afternoon when Raymond Holt had used him as a public example of inadequacy. He thought about the way the other cooks hadn't looked at him. He thought about sitting in his car afterward and just sitting. Then he thought about the 22-year-old, describing his great-aunt's red beans and rice. The 58-year-old woman who cried and didn't apologize. The man with the bowl of shelter soup. He said yes, the preparation was 6 weeks of early mornings and late evenings. Thomas worked with the 4 students, who would represent the program at the summit. Selected not because they were the most technically polished, but because they were the most ready. Which is a different and more important quality. He pushed them harder than he'd pushed anyone since Ruth's, and he did it the way he'd learned to push from the best chef he'd ever worked under. With the absolute conviction that they could do it, communicated through specificity rather than encouragement. Not you can do this, but do this exactly like this, and here's why, and now do it again. Nora tested the dishes. She was a serious and reliable taster who had very clear opinions and expressed them without hesitation. The 22-year-old, his name was Darius, and he was going to be extraordinary, started bringing her small samples of things he was working on, just to get her reaction, and she would give it to him with the gravity of a Michelin inspector, and then ruin it completely, by following up with a completely unrelated question, about whether he'd ever seen a certain movie. The night before the summit, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, and thought about Claire. Which he often did when something large was approaching. He thought about what she would say. She had been, practically and emotionally, the braver of the 2 of them, the one who had pushed him to open Ruth's in the first place, who had found the location and talked to the landlord, and presented it to him as a fait accompli, before he'd had time to talk himself out of it. She believed in him with a specificity and stubbornness that had felt at the time like ordinary love. He understood now that it was actually something rarer. He got up at 4 in the morning and drove to the community center kitchen, and went over everything one last time alone. He stood in the empty kitchen in the dark, and turned on the lights, and looked at the space. His grandmother's cast iron skillet, the actual one, which had survived everything, and which he brought to important occasions the way other people brought lucky objects, was in his kit bag by the door. He was ready. The Southern Hospitality Summit drew 600 attendees that year. The demonstration kitchen was set up in a secondary ballroom, theater style, with tiered seating and professional lighting, and the kind of audiovisual setup that cost more than Thomas's first year of restaurant rent. Industry press lined the back wall. Restaurant owners filled the middle section. In the front row, next to Margaret, sat Raymond Holt. Thomas didn't see him until they were already setting up. When he did, he felt something shift in his chest, not fear, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The specific discomfort of being seen by someone who had decided you were insufficient. He looked at Darius, checking his mise en place with total concentration. He looked at the other 3 students, a woman named Patricia, who had the most naturally calibrated palate Thomas had ever encountered, a young man named Felix, who worked with a quietness and efficiency that made experienced cooks stop and watch him, and a woman in her 40s named Grace, who had come into the program with 0 prior cooking experience, and had simply, through sheer will and attention, become good. He looked at all 4 of them. He turned back to the prep table and got to work. The demonstration ran 40 minutes. They cooked 4 dishes, a Southern-inflected menu that Thomas had designed to showcase technique within a tradition, not despite it. Nothing showy, no foam, no tweezers, no deliberate obscurity. Just food made well, from good ingredients, by people who understood what they were trying to accomplish and why. Darius's dish went out first, a low-country shrimp preparation, deceptively simple, that required precise timing across 3 separate elements. He plated it without a tremor in his hands. Patricia went next with a corn and crab bisque that made the food journalist in the back row lean forward and write something quickly in her notebook. Felix sent out a cast-iron seared chicken with a pan sauce built in front of the audience, explaining each step with the calm authority of someone who has made something so many times that explaining it feels like breathing. And Grace, who had never held a knife, 4 months ago, finished with a skillet cobbler, made from late-season peaches, that she'd driven to a farmer's market at 6 that morning to select herself. Because she had opinions about peaches now, because Thomas had taught her to have opinions. The room was quiet for a moment after the last dish went out. Not the nervous quiet of an audience, holding its breath before a verdict. The different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when something has been done well enough, that reaction takes a moment to form. Then the applause started. It was not polite conference applause. It was the kind that builds, because people are responding to something real, because they have been shown something that does not come from a performance, but from actual work, actually done, by actual human beings, who had every reason not to be there. Thomas stood beside his students and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Not pride exactly, something more specific, the feeling of having been exactly as useful as he was capable of being. Afterward, when the ballroom had thinned out and the students were doing interviews with 2 journalists who had asked to speak with them specifically, Raymond Holt found Thomas near the preparation table. Thomas saw him coming and turned to face him. Neither of them smiled. Raymond was quiet for a moment. He looked at the empty prep station, and then he looked at Thomas, and then he said, "Where did you train?" Thomas told him, "Culinary school in Atlanta, Savannah. Ruth's, which he'd opened himself and run for 4 years. Raymond was quiet again. "I didn't know about the restaurant, I didn't tell you," Thomas said. "No," Raymond said. "You didn't." That was all. Raymond Holt turned and walked out of the ballroom, and Thomas watched him go, and then turned back to where Nora had appeared from somewhere and was currently standing next to Darius, and demanding to know if there were any leftover peaches from Grace's cobbler. There were. Grace gave Nora the last serving in a paper cup with a plastic fork, and Nora ate it standing up and declared it, with complete authority, the best thing she'd had all year. Thomas laughed. It came out easier than he expected. 3 months after the summit, Margaret expanded the Lakeview culinary program to a 3rd location, this time in Greenville. She asked Thomas to design the curriculum for that program too, and to begin training the instructors who would run it after the initial cohort. A mandate that was, in practice, a significant expansion of his role, without anyone making a formal announcement about it. At the end of that year, she offered him the position officially. Director of Curriculum and Instruction, with a seat on the nonprofit's advisory board and a salary that would not make him wealthy, but would make him stable. Real stability, the kind that meant Nora could take the art class she'd been asking about for 6 months, and Thomas could fix the back fence, and there might even be, at some distant point in the future, something that resembled breathing room. He took the position. He framed neither the offer letter nor the title. He had never been much for framing things. What he did do was drive to the cemetery where Claire was buried, on a cold Tuesday afternoon when Nora was at school, and sit beside her headstone for a while. He told her about Lakeview Culinary. He told her about Darius, who had just been offered a line cook position at a respected restaurant in Charlotte. He told her about Grace's peach cobbler, and how it had made a food journalist cry in a secondary ballroom in Atlanta. He told her that he was okay, that Nora was more than okay, that their daughter was, in all the ways that mattered, completely herself, opinionated and warm and unself-conscious and funny, in exactly the way Claire had been funny. He said he missed her every day in a way that didn't go away, but had changed shape, had become less like an absence, and more like a presence, something he carried that was just part of him now. He sat there until the afternoon light started going sideways and gold through the trees. Then he drove to pick up Nora from school. She was on the front steps with her backpack on, watching the street. When she saw his car, she stood up and waved with her whole arm, enormous, unself-conscious, genuinely glad, and he pulled to the curb and she climbed in and started talking before the door was closed. He listened to every word. If you've ever been told you were too small, too quiet, too far gone to matter, you already know that the people who said that were wrong. The question has never been whether someone like Thomas Briggs deserves a second chance. The question is whether the rest of us are paying enough attention to recognize one when it's standing right in front of us.